I think this duel from 2019's The King is one of the best sword fights I've seen on screen recently. So I'm going to break down the swordplay and the filmmaking and what I think works and what I think doesn't quite work as well. In terms of context, what you need to know is that Timothy here is playing Henry, Prince of Wales, otherwise known as Hal. His brother, Thomas, has been sent to squash the rebellion of Harry the Hotspur, but Hal turns up and demands this.
Go to the rebel camp, deliver the following message to Percy Hotspur. Tell him that Prince Henry challenges him to settle today's score, man on man, he and I. We will fight in our army's places.
Yes, my lord.
This is based on Shakespeare, so narratively this really works. It makes Hal, who will ultimately become Henry V, a fascinating character. He is arrogant, and we will see that reflected in his fighting, but he's also concerned about the lives of his subjects. In terms of the duel, they're wielding longswords. They're also known as hand and a half swords. And here's a cool detail I picked up from the book The Medieval Longsword by Guy Windsor. From around 1380 to 1410, knights were beginning to wear visors, but they did not yet have catches and locks to hold them down. And both the play and the film are set around 1403. So the goal was to actually try to open up their visor and hit them in the face. And this is kind of part of the strategies that we see in play in this fight. At the start of the fight, in the first phrase, Hal and Hotspur are in wide measure. So it's entirely accurate for them to be in what Fiore would call a short guard. Fiore de Liberi was the author of the 14th century manuscript The Flowers of Battle, which is one of the oldest surviving fencing manuals. If you do HEMA like myself, you're more likely to see the long guard.
To start off with, it's useful to form the guard posta longa,
because what we do is closer to armoured fencing. But Fiore actually says that the short guard is more appropriate for those in armour than without.
You can also make that thrust from posta breva, this short position where the sword is very much withdrawn. I'm resting the pommel just below where my belt would be. My tip is maybe a little bit higher.
And you can see that in action in this shot. I really love this counter camera move. It makes the two fighters encircling each other feel really dynamic, and that adds to the tension of two people otherwise doing nothing. Fiore says that the short guard should lead into a thrust with a passing step, which is what Hal does. It's just not a very committed attack. He's forcing Hotspur back in the hopes of creating an opening, which is what happens, but that's because Hotspur drops his guard, which doesn't actually make a lot of sense. A trained swordsman should be able to retreat and hold their guard. But the backwards movement does create a sense of motivation for the guard to be dropped, so we go with it. And that lowered guard creates an opening, a very clear opening at Hotspur's head. That does bring me to a general criticism about the portrayal of longswords in popular culture. Most movies and books and comics portray longswords as heavy, cumbersome things, but trust me, they're actually very fast. The offhand near the pommel gives you very precise point control, which means they're both a great cutting and thrusting weapon. But we tend to see cuts more in theatrical swordplay because cuts are bigger motions. That means they read much better to the audience. We can understand what the fight is about, and they read much better to the performers in the scene, making the timings easier. The other thing to note is that choreographed fights are about looking cool. They're not actually about trying to hurt the opponent or even touch them. When you choreograph these things, you want to create a feeling of intensity and danger and what I call visual plausibility. Which brings us back to this moment. There's no tactical reason for Hal to go to this one-handed cut here, but it does add motion, it does look cool, and it sets up Hotspur's deflection. In a quote-unquote real fight, Hotspur would have been voiding the attack altogether. It's going to miss, and Hal has created a huge opening on his head. Just look at how he's leaning forward. But they've smartly shot this in profile, so at speed, you don't actually get a real sense of how wide that incoming attack is. And so Hotspur's choice to deflect is plausible. Hotspur's deflection is also a really big one, which visually justifies while he doesn't just bop Hal on the head as he charges past. From a story point of view, this opening attack from Hal does highlight Hal's arrogance. It's messy and it's reckless. Hotspur seems more controlled. Just look at this moment. Hal beats away Hotspur's sword, and that comes across as really quite aggressive. And what's cool about it is that beating swords is historically accurate, and it's something that can be done pretty safely by performers. And all of that leads to this great bit of choreography. When I watched this movie for the first time, it was this phrase of the fight that made me go, oh, hell yeah, they know what they're doing. Hotspur thrusts at Hal's face. Hal overparries. Totally understandable. And that allows Hotspur to cut around the opening on the other side. This is very tactical play. This forces Hal into half-swording. He parries the incoming blow by reinforcing the sword's structure with his offhand. This is historically accurate, really cool, and is quite common in armored combat, especially armored combat that is moving into close play. And we are in grapples. Hal grabs Hotspur's sword hand at the wrist, and Hotspur does the same. They're in deadlock. This happens to me in longsword sparring quite often, but our sparring is friendly, so we can't do this. And just a quick note in the filmmaking here, I think this is a wonderful moment of the choreography, the camera position, and the edit all working together. We can see the momentum of the headbutt being transferred because of the cut that is very precise. The headbutt probably wouldn't actually do that much through the armor, but it's visually plausible and it's sold really well with the filmmaking. It feels brutal. The cut point here also makes it safer for the performers to do. You don't need to hit them as hard. And Hotspur uses that headbutt to break distance and making Hal's structure weak. Hotspur can and should go for a killing blow, but they've had to slow Hotspur's reaction here because this is a choreographed fight. So we want to set up this moment, give enough time for Hal to void the blade by ducking. Again, this is accurate and very cool. I've even managed to pull it off in a tournament once. And now that creates an opportunity for Hal to lift up and throw his opponent. Grappling is a big part of HEMA and a lot of the historical texts. In fact, you can still see these kinds of throws in modern tournaments. The double leg takedown wasn't typically done in armor. It's more of an unarmored move. The problem is that in armor, your center of mass is much higher, so the counter to it is much easier. In fact, there are lots of elements of the choreography here that have the feel to me of an MMA cage fight, because I think to a modern audience that reads as a real fight. Now, it makes sense that Hal is getting Hotspur onto the ground. They're both wearing armor. Cutting weapons aren't that useful. You actually want blunt force trauma. Get them on their backs in heavy armor and then beat them up. Or stab them. Hotspur grabbing the longsword with both hands to make it a strong strike while aiming for the gap in the armor, so good. And what I really love about the filmmaking throughout this entire fight is that it's not fancy. It's mostly wide shots and medium shots. So we can see what is going on, and it makes it believable that it's these two men wailing on each other and not close-ups of performers. And they break distance. So we've gone from close play back to wide measure. We do see some of the same ideas repeated because, well, characters and people have signature moves. There's things we feel comfortable doing, especially under pressure. Hotspur starting in half swords makes sense. It's just more common in armored combat to start in a half sword. Because if you want to force the blade through a crack in the armor or under an unlocked visor, then this grip will make that easier. And we have a few more clashes in the classic hit the sword, not your opponent choreography, beloved of everything, especially Star Wars. It's the busy work of fight choreography. The fight does progress into a nice bit of kind of dueling half-swording, and we get this great strike with the crossguard. Blunt force trauma, nice. Now, I don't quite buy this disarm, because if Hotspur is hitting the weak of the sword, the top of the sword, then it should be falling behind Hal. Instead, I think Hal is actually kind of throwing the sword away, which doesn't make sense, but it is visually plausible in the movement because of the action. For story reasons, they don't actually want the sword behind Hal. They need it in front of him. They want Hal to be retreating and reaching for the backup weapon of choice for armored longsword combatants. the rondel dagger. Rondel daggers are awesome because they're really useful for stabbing between the gaps in armor. Gross. But so good. Many thanks to Gindi Wauchope from the School of Historical Fencing for his technical and historical insights. The King is great. You should watch it. It's got a great script, some great filmmaking, and some great visually plausible fight choreography. Hi, this is Stu Willis, and we are Shot Zero. We make videos, posts, and essays about shot design and swordplay sometimes. If you like what you saw, please check us out on shot-zero.com to find all the ways you can follow us. And thanks for watching.